Ahoy again, everyone. It's me, Ron Gabaldon, audiobook narrator and audiobook narrator. I just wanted to welcome you to part 2 of Hocus Pocus by Kurt Vonnegut. I hope you're enjoying it. By now, we've learned a little bit more about the history of Tarkington College and about the high school years of Eugene Debs Hartke, our narrator. I hope you're enjoying the voice that I use for Eugene, because it seems that throughout this period of Kurt Vonnegut's work, the narrators, it's all first person as opposed to his early period where he wrote things from a third person omniscient perspective. These narrators in first person, they have personalities of their own, and they have got kind of a quality to them. They have a background and everything. So I have to think about what it is that they look like and what it is that they kind of sound like, and based on what I'm given from the book. So as a military person, Eugene, I kind of figured most military people speak in a certain cadence, especially a lieutenant colonel from the regular army. He's used to speaking in front of large groups of people, like a platoon or a company or a battalion. So that's kind of how I came up with the voice for this guy, for Eugene Debs Hartke. Also wanted to remind everyone, I have books for sale, audiobooks for sale on audible.com. The latest one is Daffodil by Truant D. Memphis. Really fun. I enjoyed doing this book, and very Kurt Vonnegut-esque in the time skips and other world type of existentialism. Also for sale out there, for goofball, zany, weird, bizarro fiction, Death Gets a Book by Frank J. Edler, which is a very cartoony look at the afterlife and what a bad job it is. What a crap-ass job the afterlife would be if you became a death yourself. Also, A Death in Toledo, which takes place in the same kind of universe, but with a different death, so a different type of story. And if you're a fan of Toledo, check that one out. Catcoin, a fictional history of cryptocurrency. That's another one of those zany, weird kind of retellings of a certain type of history of cryptocurrency, and it's based on cats. So if you're into cats or RP British voices, go ahead and check that one out. I get royalties from those. It's the only way I can kind of support myself doing this kind of stuff. And it's a fun little sideline. So the more books I sell, tell everyone about it. Come find me on social media. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Blue Sky, Facebook. I think I've got some TikToks out there, me doing ukulele stuff. Yeah, come connect with me and let people know. All right, share the stuff around. So here's part 2 of Hocus Pocus by Kurt Vonnegut. Enjoy. Hocus Pocus by Kurt Vonnegut. Part 2, Chapters 6 through 10. Read by Ron Gabaldon. 6. "What's the hurry, son?" he said, and then, "If you've got a minute, I'd like to talk to you." So I stopped. That was the biggest mistake of my life. There were plenty of other exits, and I should have headed for one of those. At that moment, every other exit led to the University of Michigan, and journalism, and music making, and a lifetime of saying and wearing what I gosh darn pleased. Any other exit, in all probability, would have led me to a wife who wouldn't go insane on me, and kids who gave me love and respect. Any other exit would have led to a certain amount of misery, I know, life being what it is, but I don't think it would have led me to Vietnam, and then to teaching the unteachable at Tarkington College, and then getting fired by Tarkington, and then teaching the unteachable at the penitentiary across the lake until the biggest prison break in American history. And now I myself am a prisoner. But I stopped before the one exit blocked by Sam Wakefield. There went the ball game. Sam Wakefield asked me if I had ever considered the advantages of a career in the military. This was a man who had been wounded in World War II, the one war I would have liked to fight in, and then in Korea. He would eventually resign from the Army with the Vietnam War still going on, and then become president of Tarkington College, and then blow his brains out. I said I had already been accepted by the University of Michigan and had no interest in soldiering. He wasn't having any luck at all. The sort of kid who had reached a state-level science fair honestly wanted to go to Caltech or MIT, or someplace a lot friendlier to freestyle thinking than West Point. So he was desperate. He was going around the country recruiting the dregs of science fairs. He didn't ask me about my exhibit. He didn't ask about my grades. He wanted my body, no matter what it was. And then Father came along looking for me. The next thing I knew, Father and Sam Wakefield were laughing and shaking hands. Father was happier than I had seen him in years. He said to me, "The folks back home will think that's better than any prize at a science fair." "What's better?" I said. "You just won an appointment to the United States Military Academy," he said. "I've got a son I can be proud of now." 17 years later, in 1975, I was a lieutenant colonel on the roof of the American Embassy in Saigon, keeping everybody but Americans off helicopters that were ferrying badly rattled people out to ships offshore. We had lost a war. Losers! I wasn't the worst young scientist Sam Wakefield persuaded to come to West Point. One classmate of mine, from a little high school in Wyoming, had shown early promise by making an electric chair for rats, with little straps and a little black hood and all. That was Jack Patton. He was no relation to old Blood and Guts Patton, the famous general in World War II. He became my brother-in-law. I married his sister, Margaret. She came with her folks from Wyoming to see him graduate, and I fell in love with her. We sure could dance. Jack Patton was killed by a sniper in Hue, pronounced Way. He was a lieutenant colonel in the combat engineers. I wasn't there, but they say he got it right between the eyes. Talk about marksmanship. Whoever shot him was a real winner. The sniper didn't stay a winner very long, though, I heard. Hardly anybody does. Some of our people figured out where he was. I heard he couldn't have been more than 15 years old. He was a boy, not a man. But if he was going to play men's games, he was going to have to pay men's penalties. After they killed him, I heard, they put his little testicles and penis in his mouth as a warning to anybody else who might choose to be a sniper. Law and order, justice swift and justice sure. Let me hasten to say that no unit under my command was encouraged to engage in the mutilation of bodies of enemies, nor would I have winked at it if I had heard about it. One platoon in a battalion I led, on its own initiative, took to leaving aces of spades on the bodies of enemies, as sort of calling cards, I guess. This wasn't mutilation, strictly speaking, but still, I put a stop to it. What a foot soldier can do to a body with his pipsqueak technology is nothing, of course, when compared to the ordinary, unavoidable, perfectly routine effects of aerial bombing and artillery. One time, I saw the severed head of a bearded old man resting on the guts of an eviscerated water buffalo, covered with flies, in a bomb crater by a paddy in Cambodia. The plane whose bomb made the crater was so high when it dropped it that it couldn't even be seen from the ground. But what its bomb did, I would have to say, sure beat the ace of spades for a calling card. I don't think Jack Patton would have wanted the sniper who killed him mutilated, but you never know. When he was alive, he was like a dead man in one respect. Everything was pretty much all right with him. Everything, and I mean everything, was a joke to him, or so he said. His favorite expression right up to the end was, "I had to laugh like hell." If Lieutenant Colonel Patton is in heaven, and I don't think many truly professional soldiers have ever expected to wind up there, at least not recently, he might at this very moment be telling about how his life suddenly stopped in Hue, and then adding, without even smiling, "I had to laugh like hell." That was the thing. Patton would tell about some supposedly serious or beautiful or dangerous or holy event during which he had to laugh like hell. But he hadn't really laughed. He kept a straight face, too, when he told about it afterward. In all his life, I don't think anybody ever heard him do what he said he had to do all the time, which was laugh like hell. He said he had to laugh like hell when he won a science prize in high school for making an electric chair for rats, but he hadn't. A lot of people wanted him to stage a public demonstration of the chair with a tranquilized rat, wanted him to shave the head of a groggy rat and strap it to the chair, and according to Jack, ask it if it had any last words to say, maybe wanted to express remorse for the life of crime it had led. The execution never took place. There was enough common sense in Patton's high school, although not in the science department apparently, to have such an event denounced as cruelty to dumb animals. Again, Patton said, without smiling, "I had to laugh like hell." He said he had to laugh like hell when I married his sister Margaret. He said Margaret and I shouldn't take offense at that. He said he had to laugh like hell whenever anybody got married. I am absolutely sure that Jack did not know that there was inheritable insanity on his mother's side of the family, and neither did his sister, who would become my bride. When I married Margaret, their mother seemed perfectly okay still, except for a mania for dancing, which was a little scary sometimes, but harmless. Dancing until she dropped wasn't nearly as loony as wanting to bomb North Vietnam back to the Stone Age, or bombing any place back to the Stone Age. My mother-in-law, Mildred, grew up in Peru, Indiana, but never talked about Peru, even after she went crazy, except to say that Cole Porter, a composer of ultra-sophisticated popular songs during the first half of the last century, was also born in Peru. My mother-in-law ran away from Peru when she was 18, and never went back again. She worked her way through the University of Wyoming in Laramie, of all places, which I guess was about as far away from Peru as she could get without leaving the Milky Way. That was where she met her husband, who was then a student at the university's School of Veterinary Science. Only after the Vietnam War, with Jack long dead, did Margaret and I realize that she wanted nothing more to do with Peru because so many people there knew she came from a family famous for spawning lunatics. And then she got married, keeping her family's terrifying history to herself, and she reproduced. My own wife married and reproduced in all innocence of the danger she herself was in, and the risk she would pass on to our children. Our own children, having grown up with a notoriously insane grandmother in the house, fled this valley as soon as they could, just as she had fled Peru. But they haven't reproduced. And with their knowing what they do about their booby-trapped genes, I doubt that they ever will. Jack Patton never married. He never said he wanted kids. That could be a clue that he did know about his crazy relatives in Peru after all. But I don't believe that. He was against everybody's reproducing, since human beings were, in his own words, about 1,000 times dumber and meaner than they think they are. I myself, obviously, have finally come around to his point of view. During our plebe year, I remember, Jack all of a sudden decided that he was going to be a cartoonist, although he had never thought of being that before. He was compulsive. I could imagine him back in high school in Wyoming, all of a sudden deciding to build an electric chair for rats. The first cartoon he ever drew, and the last one, was of two rhinoceroses getting married. A regular human preacher in a church was saying to the congregation that anybody who knew any reason these two should not be joined together in holy matrimony should speak now or forever hold his peace. This was long before I had even met his sister Margaret. We were roommates, and would be for all 4 years. So he showed me the cartoon and said he bet he could sell it to Playboy. I asked him what was funny about it. He couldn't draw for sour apples. He had to tell me that the bride and groom were rhinoceroses. I thought they were a couple of sofas maybe, or maybe a couple of smashed-up sedans. That would have been fairly funny, come to think of it. 2 smashed-up sedans taking wedding vows. They were going to settle down. "What's funny about it?" said Jack incredulously. "Where's your sense of humor? If somebody doesn't stop the wedding, these two will mate and have a baby rhinoceros." "Of course," I said. "For Pete's sake," he said. "What could be uglier and dumber than a rhinoceros? Just because something can reproduce doesn't mean it should reproduce." I pointed out that to a rhinoceros, another rhinoceros was wonderful. "That's the point," he said. "Every kind of animal thinks its own kind of animal is wonderful. So people getting married think they're wonderful, and that they're going to have a baby that's wonderful, when actually they're as ugly as rhinoceroses. Just because we think we're so wonderful doesn't mean we really are. We could be really terrible animals, and just never admit it because it would hurt so much." During Jack's and my cow year at the Point, I remember, which would have been our junior year at a regular college, we were ordered to walk a tour for 3 hours on the quadrangle in a military manner, as though on serious guard duty, in full uniform and carrying rifles. This was punishment for our having failed to report another cadet who had cheated on a final examination in electrical engineering. The honor code required not only that we never lie or cheat, but that we snitch on anybody who had done those things. We hadn't seen the cadet cheat. We hadn't even been in the same class with him. But we were with him, along with one other cadet, when he got drunk in Philadelphia after the Army-Navy game. He got so drunk, he confessed that he had cheated on the exam the previous June. Jack and I told him to shut up, that we didn't want to hear about it, and that we were going to forget about it, since it probably wasn't true anyway. But the other cadet, who would later be fragged in Vietnam, turned us all in. We were as corrupt as the cheater, supposedly, for trying to cover up for him. Fragging, incidentally, was a new word in the English language that came out of the Vietnam War. It meant pitching a fizzing fragmentation grenade into the sleeping quarters of an unpopular officer. I don't mean to boast, but the whole time I was in Vietnam, nobody offered to frag me. The cheater was thrown out, even though he was a firstie, which means he would graduate in only 6 more months. And Jack and I had to walk a 3-hour tour at night in the ice-cold rain. We weren't supposed to talk to each other or to anyone, but the nonsensical posts he and I had to march intersected at one point. Jack muttered to me at one such meeting, "What would you do if you heard somebody had just dropped an atom bomb on New York City?" It would be 10 minutes before we passed again. I thought of a few answers that were obvious, such as that I would be horrified, I would want to cry, and so on. But I understood that he didn't want to hear my answer. Jack wanted me to hear his answer. So here he came with his answer. He looked me in the eye, and he said without a flicker of a smile, "I'd laugh like hell." The last time I heard him say that he had to laugh like hell was in Saigon, where I ran into him in a bar. He told me that he had just been awarded a Silver Star, which made him my equal since I already had one. He had been with a platoon from his company which was planting mines on paths leading to a village believed to be sympathetic with the enemy when a firefight broke out. So, he called for air support, and the planes dropped napalm, which is jellied gasoline developed by Harvard University, on the village, killing Vietnamese of both sexes and all ages. Afterward, he was ordered to count the bodies and to assume that they had all been enemies, so that the number of bodies could be in the news that day. That engagement was what he got the Silver Star for. "I had to laugh like hell," he said, but he didn't crack a smile. He would have wanted to laugh like hell if he had seen me on the roof of our embassy in Saigon with my pistol drawn. I had won my Silver Star for finding and personally killing 5 enemy soldiers who were hiding in a tunnel underground. Now, I was on a rooftop, while regiments of the enemy were right out in the open, with no need to hide from anybody, taking possession without opposition of the streets below. There they were down there, in case I wanted to kill lots more of them. Pow, pow, pow. I was up there to keep Vietnamese who had been on our side from getting onto helicopters that were ferrying Americans only, civilian employees at the embassy and their dependents, to our Navy ships offshore. The enemy could have shot down the helicopters and come up and captured or killed us if they wanted, but all they had ever wanted from us was that we go home. They certainly captured or killed the Vietnamese I kept off the helicopter after the very last of the Americans, who was Lieutenant Colonel Eugene Debs Hartke, was out of there. The rest of that day, the helicopter carrying the last American to leave Vietnam joined a swarm of helicopters over the South China Sea, driven from their roosts on land and running out of gasoline. How was that for natural history in the 20th century? A sky filled with chattering, man-made pterodactyls, suddenly homeless, unable to swim a stroke, about to drown or starve to death. Below us, deployed as far as the eye could see, was the most heavily armed armada in history, in no danger whatsoever from anyone. We could have all the deep blue sea we wanted as far as the enemy was concerned. Enjoy! Enjoy! My own helicopter was told by radio to hover with 2 others over a minesweeper, which had a landing platform for 1 pterodactyl, its own, which took off so that ours could land. Down we came, we got out, and sailors pushed our big, dumb, clumsy bird overboard. That process was repeated twice, and then the ship's own improbable creature claimed its roost again. I had to look inside it later on. It was loaded with electronic gear that could detect mines and submarines under the water, and incoming missiles and planes in the sky above. And then the sun itself followed the last American helicopter to leave Saigon to the bottom of the deep blue sea. At the age of 35, Eugene Debs Hartke was again as dissolute with respect to alcohol and marijuana and loose women as he had been during his last 2 years in high school. And he had lost all respect for himself and the leadership of his country, just as, 17 years earlier, he had lost all respect for himself and his father at the Cleveland, Ohio Science Fair. His mentor, Sam Wakefield, the man who recruited him for West Point, had quit the Army a year earlier in order to speak out against the war. He had become president of Tarkington College through powerful family connections. 3 years after that, Sam Wakefield would commit suicide. So, there's another loser for you, even though he had been a major general and then a college president. I think exhaustion got him. I say that not only because he seemed very tired all the time to me, but because his suicide note wasn't even original, and didn't seem to have much to do with him personally. It was, word for word, the same suicide note left way back in 1932, when I was a -8 years old, by another loser, George Eastman, inventor of the Kodak camera and founder of Eastman Kodak, now defunct, only 75 kilometers north of here. Both notes said this and nothing more. My work is done. In Sam Wakefield's case, that completed work, if he didn't want to count the Vietnam War, consisted of 3 new buildings, which probably would have been built anyway, no matter who was Tarkington's president. I am not writing this book for people below the age of 18, but I see no harm in telling young people to prepare for failure rather than success, since failure is the main thing that is going to happen to them. In terms of basketball alone, almost everybody has to lose. A high percentage of the convicts in Athena, and now in this much smaller institution, devoted their childhood and youth to nothing but basketball, and still got their brains knocked out in the early rounds of some darn fool tournament. Let me say further to the chance young reader that I would probably have wrecked my body and been thrown out of the University of Michigan and died on Skid Row somewhere if I had not been subjected to the discipline of West Point. I am talking about my body now, and not my mind. And there is no better way for a young person to learn respect for his or now her bones and nerves and muscles than to accept an appointment to any one of the 3 major service academies. I entered the Point, a young punk with bad posture and a sunken chest, and no history of sports participation save for a few fights after dances where our band played. When I graduated and received my commission as a 2nd lieutenant in the regular army and tossed my hat in the air and bought a red Corvette with the back pay the academy had put aside for me, my spine was as straight as a ramrod. My lungs were as capacious as the bellows of the Forge of Vulcan. I was captain of the judo and wrestling teams. I had not smoked any sort of cigarette or swallowed a drop of alcohol for 4 whole years. Nor was I sexually promiscuous anymore. I never felt better in my life. I remember saying to my mother and father at graduation, "Can this be me?" They were so proud of me, and I was so proud of me. I turned to Jack Patton, who was there with his booby-trapped sister and mother and his normal father, and I asked him, "What do you think of us now, Lieutenant Patton?" He was the goat of our class, meaning he had the lowest grade average. So had General George Patton been, again no relative of Jack's, who had been such a great leader in World War II. What Jack replied, of course, unsmilingly, was that he had to laugh like hell. 7. I have been reading issues of the Tarkington College Alumni Magazine, The Musketeer, going all the way back to its first issue, which came out in 1910. It was so named in honor of Musket Mountain, a high hill, not a mountain, on the western edge of the campus, at whose foot, next to the stable, so many victims of the escaped convicts are buried now. Every proposed physical improvement of the college plant triggered a storm of protest. When Tarkington graduates came back here, they wanted it to be exactly as they had remembered it. And one thing at least never did change, which was the size of the student body, stabilized at 300 since 1925. Meanwhile, of course, the growth of the prison population on the other side of the lake, invisible behind walls, was as irresistible as Thunder Beaver, as Niagara Falls. Judging from letters to the Musketeer, I think the change that generated the most passionate resistance was the modernization of the Lutz Carillon soon after World War II, a memorial to Ernest Hubble Hiscock. He was a Tarkington graduate who, at the age of 21, was a nose gunner on a Navy bomber whose pilot crashed his plane with a full load of bombs onto the flight deck of a Japanese aircraft carrier in the Battle of Midway during World War II. I would have given anything to die in a war that meaningful. Me? I was in show business, trying to get a big audience for the government on TV by killing real people with live ammunition, something the other advertisers were not free to do. The other advertisers had to fake everything. Oddly enough, the actors always turned out to be a lot more believable on the little screen than we were. Real people in real trouble don't come across somehow. There is still so much we have to learn about TV. Hiscock's parents, who were divorced and remarried but still friends, chipped in to have the bells mechanized so that one person could play them by means of a keyboard. Before that, many people had to haul away on ropes, and once a bell was set swinging, it stopped swinging on its own sweet time. There was no way of damping it. In the old days, 4 of the bells were famously off-key, but beloved, and were known as Pickle and Lemon and Big Cracked John and Beelzebub. The Hiscocks had them sent to Belgium, to the same bell foundry where Andre Lutz had been an apprentice so long ago. There, they were machined and weighted to perfect pitch, their condition when I got to play them. It can't have been music the Carillon made in the old days. Those who used to make whatever it was described it in letters to the musketeer with the same sort of batty love and berserk gratitude I hear from convicts when they tell me what it was like to take heroin laced with amphetamine, and angel dust laced with LSD, and crack alone, and on and on. I think of all those learning disabled kids in the old days, hauling away on ropes with the bells clanging sweet and sour and as loud as thunder directly overhead, and I am sure they were finding the same undeserved happiness so many of the convicts found in chemicals. And haven't I myself said that the happiest parts of my life were when I played the bells? With absolutely no basis in reality, I felt like many an addict that I'd won. When I was made Carillonneur, I taped this sign on the door of the chamber containing the keyboard: Thor. That's who I felt like when I played, sending thunderbolts down the hillside and through the industrial ruins of Scipio and out over the lake and up to the walls of the prison on the other side. There were echoes when I played, bouncing off the empty factories and the prison walls, and arguing with notes just leaving the bells overhead. When Lake Mohiga was frozen, their argument was so loud that people who had never been in the area before thought the prison had its own set of bells, and that their Carillonneur was mocking me. And I would yell into the mad clashing of bells and echoes, "Laugh, Jack, laugh!" After the prison break, the college president would shoot convicts down below from the belfry. The acoustics of the valley would cause the escapees to make many wrong guesses as to where the shots were coming from. 8. In my day, the bells no longer swung. They were welded to rigid shafts. Their clappers had been removed. They were struck instead by bolts thrust by electricity from Niagara Falls. Their singing could be stopped in an instant by brakes lined with neoprene. The room, in which a dozen or more learning-disabled bell-pullers used to be zonked out of their skulls by hellishly loud cacophony, contained a 3-octave keyboard against one wall. The holes for the ropes on the ceiling had been plugged and plastered over. Nothing works up there anymore. The room with the keyboard and the belfry above were riddled by bullets, and also bazooka shells fired by escaped convicts down below, after a sniper up among the bells shot and killed 11 of them, and wounded 15 more. The sniper was the president of Tarkington College. Even though he was dead when the convicts got to him, They were so outraged that they crucified him in the loft of the stable, where the students used to keep their horses at the foot of Musket Mountain. So, a president of Tarkington, my mentor, Sam Wakefield, blew his brains out with a Colt .45, and his successor, although he couldn't feel anything, was crucified. One would have to say that was extra heavy history. As for light history, the no longer useful clappers of the bells were hung in order of size but unlabeled on the wall of the foyer of this library above the perpetual motion machines. So it became a college tradition for upper-class persons to tell incoming freshmen that the clappers were the petrified penises of different mammals. The biggest clapper, which had once belonged to Beelzebub, the biggest bell, was said to be the penis of none other than Moby Dick, the great white whale. Many of the freshmen believed it, and were watched to see how long they went on believing it, just as they had been watched when they were little, no doubt, to see how long they would go on believing in the Tooth Fairy, the Easter Bunny, and Santa Claus. Vietnam. Most of the letters to the Musketeer protesting the modernization of the Lutz Carillon are from people who had somehow hung on to the wealth and power they had been born into. One, though, is from a man who admitted that he was in prison for fraud, and that he had ruined his life and that of his family with his twin addictions to alcohol and gambling. His letter was like this book, a gallows speech. One thing he had still looked forward to, he said, after he had paid his debt to society, was returning to Scipio to ring the bells with ropes again. "Now you take that away from me," he said. One letter is from an old bell puller, very likely dead by now, a member of the class of 1924 who had married a man named Martinus de Wet, the owner of a gold mine in Krugersdorp, South Africa. She knew the history of the bells, that they had been made from the weapons gathered up after the Battle of Gettysburg. She did not mind that the bells would soon be played electrically. The bad idea, as far as she was concerned, was that the sour bells, Pickle and Lemon and Big Cracked John and Beelzebub, were going to be turned on lathes in Belgium until they were either in tune or on the scrap heap. "Are Tarkington students no longer to be humanized and humbled as I was day after day?" she asked, "by the cries from the bell tower of the dying on the sacred blood-soaked grounds of Gettysburg?" The bells controversy inspired a lot of purple prose like that, much of it dictated to a secretary or a machine, no doubt. It was quite possible that Mrs. DeWitt graduated from Tarkington without being able to write any better than most of the ill-educated prisoners across the lake. If my socialist grandfather, nothing but a gardener at Butler University, could read a letter from Mrs. DeWitt and note its South African return address, he would be grimly gratified. There was as clear as crystal demonstration of a woman living high on profits from the labor of black miners, overworked and underpaid. He would have seen the exploitation of the poor and powerless in the growth of the prison across the lake as well. The prison, to him, would have been a scheme for depriving the lower social orders of leadership in the class struggle, and for providing them with a horrible alternative to accepting whatever their greedy paymasters would give them in the way of working conditions and subsistence. By the time I got to Tarkington College, though, he would have been wrong about the meaning of the prison across the lake, since poor and powerless people, no matter how docile, were no longer of use to canny investors. What they used to do was now being done by heroic and uncomplaining machinery. So, an appropriate sign to put over the gate to Athena might have been, instead of "work makes free," for example, "Too bad you were born. Nobody has any use for you." Or maybe, "Come in and stay in, all you burdens on society." 9. A former roommate of Ernest Hubble Hiscock, the dead war hero, who had also been in the war, who had lost an arm as a Marine on Iwo Jima, wrote that the memorial Hiscock himself would have wanted most was a promise by the Board of Trustees at the start of each academic year to keep the enrollment the same size it had been in his time. So, if Ernest Hubble Hiscock is looking down from heaven now, or wherever it is that war heroes go after dying, he would be dismayed to see his beloved campus surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers. The bells are shot to hell. The number of students, if you can call convicts that, is about 2,000 now. When there were only 300 students here, each one had a bedroom and a bathroom and plenty of closets, all his or her own. Each bedroom was part of a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom suite with a common living room for 2. Each living room had couches and easy chairs and a working fireplace and state-of-the-art sound reproduction equipment and a big screen TV. At the Athena State Prison, as I would discover when I went to work over there were 6 men to each cell, and each cell had been built for 2. Each 50 cells had a recreation room with 1 ping-pong table and 1 TV. The TV, moreover, only showed tapes of programs, including news, at least 10 years old. The idea was to keep the prisoners from becoming distressed about anything going on in the outside world that hadn't been all taken care of one way or the other, presumably, in the long ago. They could feast their eyes on whatever they liked, just so long as it wasn't relevant. How those letter writers loved not just the college, but the whole Mohiga Valley. The seasons, the lake, the forest primeval on the other side. And there were few differences between student pleasures in their times and my own. In my time, students didn't skate on the lake anymore, but on an indoor rink given in 1971 by the Israel Cohen family. But they still had sailboat races and canoe races on the lake. They still had picnics by the ruins of the locks at the head of the lake. Many students still brought their own horses to school with them. In my time, several students brought not just 1 horse, but 3, since polo was a major sport. In 1976, and again in 1980, Tarkington College had an undefeated polo team. There are no horses in the stable now, of course. The escaped convicts, surrounded and starving, a mere 4 days after the prison break, calling themselves freedom fighters and flying an American flag from the top of the bell tower of this library, ate the horses and the campus dogs too, and fed pieces of them to their hostages, who were the trustees of the college. The most successful athlete ever to come from Tarkington, arguably, was a horseman from my own time, Lowell Chung. He won a bronze medal as a member of the United States equestrian team in Seoul, South Korea, back in 1988. His mother owned half of Honolulu, but he couldn't read or write or do math worth a darn. He could sure do physics, though. He could tell me how levers and lenses and electricity and heat and all sorts of power plants worked, and predictably correct what an experiment would prove before I'd performed it, just as long as I didn't insist that he quantify anything, that he tell me what the numbers were. He earned his Associate in the Arts and Sciences degree in 1984. That was the only degree we awarded. Fair warning to other institutions and future employers, and to the students themselves, that our graduates' intellectual achievements, while respectable, were unconventional. Lowell Chung got me on a horse for the first time in my life when I was 43 years old. He dared me. I told him I certainly wasn't going to commit suicide on the back of one of his firecracker polo ponies, since I had a wife and a mother-in-law and 2 children to support. So he borrowed a gentle, patient old mare from his girlfriend at the time, who was Claudia Roosevelt. Comically enough, Lowell's then girlfriend was a whiz at arithmetic, but otherwise a nitwit. You could ask her, what is 5,111 times 10,022 divided by 97? Claudia would reply, that's 528,066.4. So what? So what? So what indeed? The lesson I myself learned over and over again when teaching at the college and then at the prison was the uselessness of information to most people, except as entertainment. If facts weren't funny or scary or couldn't make you rich, the heck with them. When I later went to work at the prison, I encountered a mass murderer named Alton Darwin, who also could do arithmetic in his head. He was black. Unlike Claudia Roosevelt, he was highly intelligent in the verbal area. The people he had murdered were rivals or deadbeats or police informers or cases of mistaken identity or innocent bystanders in the illegal drug industry. His manner of speaking was elegant and thought-provoking. He hadn't killed nearly as many people as I had, but then again, he hadn't had my advantage, which was the full cooperation of our government. Also, he had done all his killing for reasons of money. I had never stooped to that. When I found out he could do arithmetic in his head, I said to him, "That's a remarkable gift you have." "Doesn't seem fair, does it?" he said, "that somebody should come into the world with such a great advantage over the common folk? When I get out of here, I'm going to buy me a pretty striped tent and put up a sign saying $1. Come on in and see the nigger do arithmetic." He wasn't ever going to get out of there. He was serving a life sentence without hope of parole. Darwin's fantasy about starring in a mental arithmetic show when he got out, incidentally, was inspired by something one of his great-grandfathers did in South Carolina after World War I. All the airplane pilots back then were white, and some of them did stunt flying at county fairs. They were called barnstormers. And one of these barnstormers with a two-cockpit plane strapped Darwin's great-grandfather in the front cockpit, even though the great-grandfather couldn't even drive an automobile. The barnstormer crouched down in the rear cockpit so people couldn't see him, but he could still work the controls. And people came from far and wide, according to Darwin, to see the nigger fly the airplane. He was only 25 years old when we first met, the same age as Lowell Chung when Lowell won the bronze medal for horseback riding in Seoul, South Korea. When I was 25, I hadn't killed anybody yet, and hadn't had nearly as many women as Darwin had. When he was only 20, he told me, he paid cash for a Ferrari. I didn't have a car of my own, which was a good car, all right, a Chevrolet Corvette, but nowhere near as good as a Ferrari, until I was 21. At least I, too, had paid cash. When we talked at the prison, he had a running joke that was the assumption that we came from different planets. The prison was all there was to his planet, and I had come in a flying saucer from one that was much bigger and wiser. This enabled him to comment ironically on the only sexual activities possible inside the walls. "You have little babies on your planet?" he asked. "Yes, we have little babies," I said. "We got people here trying to have babies every which way," he said. "But they never get babies. What do you think they're doing wrong?" He was the first convict I heard use the expression, the PB. He told me that sometimes he wished he had the PB. I thought he meant TB, short for tuberculosis, another common affliction at the prison, common enough that I have it now. It turned out that PB was short for parole board, which is what the convicts called AIDS. That was when we first met, back in 1991, when he said that sometimes he wished he had the PB, and long before I myself contracted TB. Alphabet soup. He was hungry for descriptions of this valley, to which he had been sentenced for the rest of his life, and where he could expect to be buried, but which he had never seen. Not only the convicts, but their visitors, too, were kept as ignorant as possible of the precise geographical situation of the prison, so that anybody escaping would have no clear idea of what to watch out for or which way to go. Visitors were brought into the cul-de-sac of the valley from Rochester in buses with blacked-out windows. Convicts themselves were delivered in windowless steel boxes, capable of holding 10 of them wearing leg irons and handcuffs, mounted on the beds of trucks. The buses and the steel boxes were never opened until they were well inside the prison walls. These were exceedingly dangerous and resourceful criminals, after all. While the Japanese had taken over the operation of Athena by the time I got there, hoping to operate it at a profit, the blacked-out buses and steel boxes had been in use long before they got there. Those morbid forms of transportation became a common sight on the road to and from Rochester in maybe 1977, about 2 years after I and my little family took up residence in Scipio. The only change the Japanese made in the vehicles, which was underway when I went to work over there in 1991, was to remount the old steel boxes on new Japanese trucks. So it was in violation of long-standing prison policy that I told Alton Darwin and other lifers all they wanted to know about the valley. I thought they were entitled to know about the great forest, which was their forest now, and the beautiful lake, which was their lake now, and the beautiful little college, which was where the music from the bells was coming from. And, of course, this enriched their dreams of escaping. But what were those but what we would call in any other context the virtue hope? I never thought they would ever really get out of here and make use of the knowledge I had given them of the countryside, and neither did they. I used to do the same sort of thing in Vietnam, too, helping mortally wounded soldiers dream that they would soon be well and home again. Why not? I am as sorry as anybody that Darwin and all the rest really tasted freedom. They were horrible news for themselves and everyone. A lot of them were real homicidal maniacs. Darwin wasn't one of those, but even as the convicts were crossing the ice to Scipio, he was giving orders as if he were an emperor, as if the break were his idea, although he had nothing to do with it. He hadn't known it was coming. Those who actually breached the walls and opened the cells had come down from Rochester to free only one convict. They got him, and they were headed out of the valley, and had no interest in conquering Scipio and its little army of 6 regular policemen and 3 unarmed campus cops and an unknown number of firearms in private hands. Alton Darwin was the first example I had ever seen of leadership in the raw. He was a man without any badges of rank and with no previously existing organization or widely understood plan of action. He had been a modest, unremarkable man in prison. The moment he got out, though, sudden delusions of grandeur made him the only man who knew what to do next, which was to attack Scipio, where glory and riches awaited all who dared to follow him. "Follow me!" he cried, and some did. He was a sociopath, I think, in love with himself and no one else, craving action for its own sake, and indifferent to any long-term consequences. A classic man of destiny. Most did not even follow him down the slope and out onto the ice. They returned to the prison, where they had beds of their own, and shelter from the weather, and food and water, although no heat or electricity. They chose to be good boys, concluding correctly that bad boys, roaming free in the valley, but completely surrounded by the forces of law and order, would be shot on sight in a day or two, or maybe even sooner. They were color-coded, after all. In the Mohiga Valley, their skin alone sufficed as a prison uniform. About half of those who followed Darwin out onto the ice turned back before they reached Scipio. This was before they were fired upon and suffered their first casualty. One of those who went back to the prison told me that he was sickened when he realized how much murder and rape there would be when they reached the other side in just a few minutes. "I thought about all the little children fast asleep in their beds," he said. He handed over the gun he had stolen from the prison armory to the man next to him, there in the middle of beautiful Lake Mohiga. "He didn't have a gun," he said, "until I gave him one." "Did you wish each other good luck or anything like that?" I asked him. "We didn't say anything," he told me. "Nobody was saying anything but the man in front." "And what was he saying?" I asked. He replied with terrible emptiness, "Follow me, follow me, follow me." "Life's a bad dream," he said. "Do you know that?" Alton Darwin's charismatic delusions of grandeur went on and on. He declared himself to be president of a new country. He set up his headquarters in the Board of Trustees room of Somoza Hall, with the big long table for his desk. I visited him there at high noon on the second day after the Great Escape. He told me that this new country of his was going to cut down the virgin forest on the other side of the lake and sell the wood to the Japanese. He would use the money to refurbish the abandoned industrial buildings in Scipio down below. He didn't know yet what they would manufacture, but he was thinking hard about that. He would welcome any suggestions I might have. Nobody would dare attack him, he said, for fear he would harm his hostages. He held the entire Board of Trustees captive, but not the college president, Henry Tex Johnson, nor his wife, Zuzu. I had come to ask Darwin if he had any idea what had become of Tex and Zuzu. He didn't know. Zuzu, it would turn out, had been killed by a person or persons unknown, possibly raped, possibly not. We will never know. It was not an ideal time for forensic medicine. Tex, meanwhile, was ascending the tower of the library here with a rifle and ammunition. He was going clear to the top to turn the belfry itself into a sniper's nest. Alton Darwin was never worried, no matter how bad things got. He laughed when he heard that paratroops advancing on foot had surrounded the prison across the lake and, on our side, were digging in to the west and south of Scipio. State police and vigilantes had already set up a roadblock at the head of the lake. Alton Darwin laughed as though he had achieved a great victory. I knew people like that in Vietnam. Jack Patton had that sort of courage. I could be as brave as Jack over there. In fact, I am pretty sure that I was shot at more and killed more people, but I was worried sick most of the time. Jack was never worried. He told me so. I asked him how he could be that way. He said, "I think I might have a screw loose. I can't care about what might happen next to me or anyone." Alton Darwin had the same untightened screw. He was a convicted mass murderer, but never showed any remorse that I could see. During my last year in Vietnam, I too reacted at press briefings as though our defeats were victories. But I was under orders to do that. That wasn't my natural disposition. Alton Darwin, and this was true of Jack Patton too, spoke of trivial and serious manners in the same tone of voice, with the same gestures and facial expressions. Nothing mattered more or less than anything else. Alton Darwin, I remember, was talking to me with seemingly deep concern about how many of the convicts who had crossed the ice with him to Scipio were deserting, were going back across the ice to the prison, or turning themselves in at the roadblock at the head of the lake in hopes of amnesty. The deserters were worriers. They didn't want to die. And they didn't want to be held responsible, even though many of them were responsible for the murders and rapes in Scipio. So I was pondering the desertion problem when Alton Darwin said with exactly the same intensity, "I can skate on the ice. Do you believe that?" "I beg your pardon?" I said. "I could always roller skate," he said, "but I never got a chance to ice skate till this morning." That morning, with the phones dead and the electricity cut off, with unburied bodies everywhere, and with all the food in Scipio already consumed as though by a locust plague, he had gone up to Cohen Rink and had put on ice skates for the first time in his life. After a few tottering steps, he had found himself gliding around and around and around and around. "Roller skating and ice skating are just about the very same thing," he told me triumphantly, as though he had made a scientific discovery that was going to throw an entirely new light on what had seemed a hopeless situation. "Same muscles," he said importantly. That's what he was doing when he was fatally shot about an hour later. He was out on the rink, gliding around and around and around and around. I'd left him in his office, and I assumed that he was still up there. But there he was on the rink instead, going around and around and around and around. A shot rang out, and he fell down. Several of his followers went to him, and he said something to them, and then he died. It was a beautiful shot, if Darwin was really the man the college president was shooting at. He could have been shooting at me, since he knew I used to make love to his wife Zuzu when he was out of the house. If he was shooting at Darwin instead of me, he solved one of the most difficult problems in marksmanship, the same problem solved by Lee Harvey Oswald when he shot President Kennedy, which is where to aim when you are high above your target. As I say, beautiful shot. I asked later what Alton Darwin's last words had been, and was told that they made no sense. His last words had been, "See the nigger fly the airplane." 10. Sometimes Alton Darwin would talk to me about the planet he was on before he was transported in a steel box to Athena. "Drugs were food," he said. "I was in the food business. Just because people on one planet eat a certain kind of food they're hungry for that makes them feel better after they eat it, that doesn't mean people on other planets shouldn't eat something else. On some planets, I'm sure there are people who eat stones and then feel wonderful for a little while afterwards. Then it's time to eat stones again." I thought very little about the prison during the 15 years I was a teacher at Tarkington, as big and brutal as it was across the lake, and growing all the time. When we went picnicking at the head of the lake, or went up to Rochester on some errand or other, I saw plenty of blacked-out buses and steel boxes on the backs of trucks. Alton Darwin might have been in one of those boxes. Then again, Since the steel boxes were also used to carry freight, there might have been nothing but Diet Pepsi and toilet paper in there. Whatever was in there was none of my business until Tarkington fired me. Sometimes, when I was playing the bells and getting particularly loud echoes from the prison walls, usually in the dead of winter time, I would have the feeling that I was shelling the prison. In Vietnam, conversely, if I happened to be back with the artillery and the guns were lobbing shells at who knows what in some jungle, it seemed very much like music. Interesting noises for the sake of interesting noises, and nothing more. During a summer field exercise, when Jack Patton and I were still cadets, I remember, we were asleep in a tent and the artillery opened up nearby. We awoke. Jack said to me, "They're playing our tune, Gene. They're playing our tune." Before I went to work at Athena, I had seen only 3 convicts anywhere in the valley. Most people in Scipio hadn't seen even one. I wouldn't have seen even one either if a truck with a steel box in back hadn't broken down at the head of the lake. I was picnicking there, near the water, with Margaret, my wife, and Mildred, my mother-in-law. Mildred was crazy as a bedbug by then, but Margaret was still sane, and there seemed a good chance that she always would be. I was only 45, foolishly confident that I would go on teaching here until I reached the mandatory retirement age of 70 in 2010, 9 years from now. What in fact will happen to me in 9 more years? That is like worrying about a cheese spoiling if you don't put it in the refrigerator. What can happen to a pricelessly stinky cheese that hasn't already happened to it? My mother-in-law, no danger to herself or anyone else, adored fishing. I had put a worm on her hook for her and pitched it out to a spot that looked promising. She gripped the rod with both hands, sure as always that something miraculous was about to happen. She was right this time. I looked up at the top of the bank, and there was a prison truck, with smoke pouring out of its engine compartment. There were only 2 guards on board, and one of them was the driver. They bailed out. They had already radioed the prison for help. They were both white. This was before the Japanese took over Athena as a business proposition, before the road signs all the way from Rochester were in both English and Japanese. It looked as though the truck might catch fire, so the 2 guards unlocked the little door in the back of the steel box and told the prisoners to come out, and then they backed off and waited with sawed-off automatic shotguns leveled at the little door. Out the prisoners came. There were only 3 of them, clumsy in leg irons, and their handcuffs were shackled to chains around their waists. 2 were black, and 1 was white, or possibly a light Hispanic. This was before the Supreme Court confirmed that it was indeed cruel and inhuman punishment to confine a person in a place where his or her race was greatly outnumbered by another one. The races were still mixed in prisons throughout the country. When I later went to work at Athena, though, there was nothing but people who had been classified as black in there. My mother-in-law did not turn around to see the smoking van and all. She was obsessed by what might happen at any moment at the other end of her fish line. But Margaret and I gawked. For us, back then, prisoners were like pornography. Common things nice people shouldn't want to see, even though the biggest industry by far in this valley was punishment. When Margaret and I talked about it later, she didn't say it was like pornography. She said it was like seeing animals on their way to a slaughterhouse. We, in turn, must have looked to those convicts like people in paradise. It was a balmy day in the springtime. A sailboat race was going on to the south of us. The college had just been given 30 little sloops by a grateful parent who had cleaned out the biggest savings and loan bank in California. Our brand new Mercedes sedan was parked on the beach nearby. It cost more than my annual salary at Tarkington. The car was a gift from the mother of a student of mine named Pierre Legrand. His maternal grandfather had been dictator of Haiti and had taken the treasury of that country with him when he was overthrown. That was why Pierre's mother was so rich. He was very unpopular. He tried to win friends by making expensive gifts to them, but that didn't work. So he tried to hang himself from a girder of the water tower on top of Musket Mountain. I happened to be up there, in the bushes, with the wife of the coach of the tennis team. So I cut him down with my Swiss Army knife. That was how I got the Mercedes. Pierre would have better luck 2 years later, jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge, and a campus joke was that now I had to give the Mercedes back. So, there were plenty of heartaches in what, as I've said, must have looked to those 3 convicts like paradise. There was no way they could tell that my mother-in-law was as crazy as a bedbug, as long as she kept her back to them. They could not know, and neither could I, of course, that hereditary insanity would hit my pretty wife like a ton of bricks in about 6 months' time, and turn her into a hag as scary as her mother. If we had had our 2 kids with us on the beach, that would have completed the illusion that we lived in paradise. They could have depicted another generation that found life as comfortable as we did. Both sexes would have been represented. We had a girl named Melanie and a boy named Eugene Debs Hartke, Jr. But they weren't kids anymore. Melanie was 21 and studying mathematics at Cambridge University in England. Eugene Jr. was completing his senior year at Deerfield Academy in Massachusetts and was 18. And he had his own rock and roll band and had composed maybe 100 songs by then. But Melanie would have spoiled our tableau on the beach. Like my mother, until she went to Weight Watchers, she was very heavy. That must be hereditary. If she had kept her back to the convicts, she might at least have concealed the fact that she had a bulbous nose, like the late great alcoholic comedian W.C. Fields. Melanie, thank goodness, was not also an alcoholic. But her brother was. And I could kill myself now for having boasted to him that on my side of the family, the men had no fear of alcohol, since they knew how to drink in moderation. We were not weak and foolish where drugs were concerned. At least Eugene Jr. was beautiful, having inherited the features of his mother. When he was growing up in this valley, people could not resist saying to me, with him right there to hear it, that he was the most beautiful child they'd ever seen. I have no idea where he is now. He stopped communicating with me or anybody in this valley years ago. He hates me. So does Melanie, although she wrote to me as recently as 2 years ago. She was living in Paris with another woman. They were both teaching English and math in an American high school over there. My kids will never forgive me for not putting my mother-in-law into a mental hospital instead of keeping her at home, where she was a great embarrassment to them. They couldn't bring friends home. If I had put Mildred into a nut house, though, I couldn't have afforded to send Melanie and Eugene Jr. to such expensive schools. I got a free house at Tarkington, but my salary was small. Also, I didn't think Mildred's craziness was as unbearable as they did. In the Army, I had grown used to people who talked nonsense all day long. Vietnam was one big hallucination. After adjusting to that, I could adjust to anything. What my children most dislike me for, though, is my reproducing in conjunction with their mother. They live in constant dread of suddenly going as batty as Mildred and Margaret. Unfortunately, there is a good chance of that. Ironically enough, I happen to have an illegitimate son about whom I learned only recently. Since he had a different mother, he need not expect to go insane someday. Some of his kids, if he ever has any, could inherit my own mother's tendency to fatness, though. But they could join Weight Watchers, as Mother did. Heredity is obviously much on my mind these days, and should be. So I have been reading up on it some in a book that also deals with embryology. People who are wary of what they might find in a book if they opened one are right to be. I have just had my mind blown by an essay on the embryology of the human eye. No combination of time and luck could have produced a camera that excellent. Not even if the quantity of time had been 1 trillion years. How is that for an unsolved mystery? When I went to work at Athena, I hoped to find at least one of the 3 convicts who had seen Mildred and Margaret and me having a picnic so long ago. As I've said, I took one of them to be white, or possibly Hispanic. So he would have been transferred to a white or Hispanic prison before I ever got there. The other 2 were clearly black, but I never found either of them. I would have liked to hear what we looked like to them. How contented we seemed to be. They were probably dead. AIDS could have got them, or murder, or suicide, or maybe tuberculosis. Every year, 30 inmates at Athena died for every student who was awarded an Associate in the Arts and Sciences degree by Tarkington. Parole. If I had found a convict who had witnessed our picnic, we might have talked about the fish my mother-in-law hooked while he was watching. He saw her rod bend double, heard the reel scream like a little siren, but he never got to see the monster who had taken her bait and was headed south for Scipio. Before he could see it, he was back in darkness in another van. It was heavy test line I had put on the reel. This was deep sea stuff made for tuna and shark, although, as far as we knew, there was nothing in Lake Mohiga but eels and perch and a little catfish. That was all Mildred had ever caught before. One time, I remember, she caught a perch too little to keep. So I turned it loose, even though the barb of the hook had come out through one eye. A few minutes later, she hooked that same perch again. We could tell by the mangled eye. Think about that. Miraculous eyes, and no brains whatsoever. I put such heavy test line on Mildred's reel so that nothing could ever get away from her. In Honduras one time, I did the same thing for a 3-star general whose aide I was. Mildred's fish couldn't snap the line, and Mildred wouldn't let go of the rod. She didn't weigh anything, and the fish weighed a lot for a fish. Mildred went down on her knees in the water, laughing and crying. I'll never forget what she was saying. "It's God! It's God!" I waded out to help her. She wouldn't let go of the rod, so I grasped the line and began to haul it in, hand over hand. How the water swirled and boiled out there. When I got the fish into shallow water, it suddenly quit fighting. I guess it had used up every bit of its energy. That was that. This fish, which I picked up by the gills and flung up on the bank, was an enormous pickerel. Margaret looked down at it in horror and said, "It's a crocodile." I looked at the top of the bank to see what the convicts and guards thought of a fish that big. They were gone. There was nothing but the broken-down van up there. The little door to its steel box was wide open. Anybody was free to climb inside and close the door, in case he or she wondered what it felt like to be a prisoner. To those fascinated by forensic medicine, the pickerel had not bitten on the worm on the hook. It had bitten on a perch, which had bitten on the worm on the hook. I thought that would be interesting to my mother-in-law during our trip back home in the new Mercedes, but she didn't want to talk about the fish at all. It had scared the daylights out of her, and she wanted to forget it. As the years went by, I would mention the fish from time to time without getting anything back from her but a stony silence. I concluded that she really had purged it from her memory. But then, on the night of the prison break, when the three of us were living in an old house in the hamlet of Athena, down below the prison walls, there was this terrific explosion that woke us up. If Jack Patton had been there with us, he might have said to me, "Gene, they're playing our tune again." The explosion was, in fact, the demolition of Athena's main gate from the outside, not the inside. The purported head of the Jamaican drug cartel, Jeffrey Turner, had been brought down to Athena in a steel box 6 months before, after a televised trial lasting a year and a half. He was given 25 consecutive life sentences, said to be a new record. Now, a well-rehearsed force of his employees, variously estimated as being anything from a platoon to a company, had arrived outside the prison with explosives, a tank, and several half-tracks taken from the National Guard Armory, about 10 kilometers south of Rochester, across the highway from the Meadowdale Cinema Complex. One of their number, it has since come out, moved to Rochester and joined the National Guard, swearing to defend the Constitution and all that, with the sole purpose of stealing the keys to the armory. The Japanese guards were wholly unprepared and unmotivated to resist such a force, especially since the attackers were all dressed in American military uniforms and waving American flags. So they hid or put their hands up or ran off into the virgin forest. This wasn't their country, and guarding prisoners wasn't a sacred mission or anything like that. It was just a business. The telephone and power lines were cut, so they couldn't even call for help or blow the siren. The assault lasted half an hour. When it was over, Jeffrey Turner was gone, and he hasn't been seen since. The attackers also disappeared. Their uniforms and military vehicles were subsequently found at an abandoned dairy farm owned by German land speculators a kilometer north of the end of the lake. There were tire tracks of many automobiles, which led police to conclude that it was by means of unremarkable civilian vehicles, seemingly unrelated and no doubt leaving the farm at timed intervals, that the lawless force had made its 100% successful getaway. Meanwhile, back at the prison, anyone who didn't want to stay inside the walls anymore was free to walk out of there, first taking, if he so inclined, and got there early, a rifle, or a shotgun, or a pistol, or a tear gas grenade from the wide-open prison armory. The police said, too, that the attackers of the prison obviously had had first-class military training somewhere, possibly at a private survival school somewhere in this country, or maybe in Bolivia, or Colombia, or Peru. Anyway, Margaret and Mildred and I were awakened by the explosion, which demolished the main gate of the prison. There was no way we could have imagined what was really going on. The three of us were sleeping in separate bedrooms. Margaret was on the first floor. Mildred and I were on the second floor. No sooner had I sat up, my ears ringing, than Mildred came into my room stark naked, her eyes open wide. She spoke first. She used a slang word for hugeness, I had never heard her speak before. It wasn't slang of her generation, or even mine. It was slang of my children's generation. I guess she had heard it and liked it, and then held it in reserve for some really important occasion. Here is what she said as sporadic small arms fire broke out at the prison. "Do you remember that humongous fish I caught?"